So I know you've recently you've been on it when it comes to Ukraine, but now that everything's happening in Palestine, particularly in the Middle East, and you have spent time both in Syria and Gaza, I've read your accounts and I noticed that very little has changed except the public acknowledgement of what's happening. Why do you think that the public is finally starting to notice this after years of covering this with very little mainstream media coverage, very little attention from the American public to how the U.S. backs Israel in not just funding, but also any other needs that they have in order for them to continue their takeover of the Middle East, including obviously Palestine. Why do you think people are finally paying attention?
I would say it's a mixture of factors. We have now, Israel started its fourth genocide of Palestinians in Gaza in just over a decade. If we want to go back to 2006, we could also talk about Israel's bombing in Gaza, but let's just look at the 2008-9 war, where I was in Gaza at the time, the 2012 war in Gaza, I was also there, the 2014 war, I was not there, and I was following from afar. And reading accounts that war, 52 days, I believe, was even more horrendous than the two previous ones I'd seen, which were already incredibly horrendous and just unbelievable. The atrocities committed by the Israeli army against unarmed Palestinian civilians. So I think that now here's the fourth massacre of Palestinian civilians occurring. And Israel, as much as it tries to keep the truth of its war crimes and its genocide silent, it can't. Palestinians have empowered themselves, unfortunately unfortunately that we have to use tools like Twitter, which is rampantly censoring, and Facebook and YouTube. But nonetheless, in spite of that, Palestinians have been able to tell their own story, filming what the bombing and getting their own voices on social media. In spite of Israel routinely attacking journalists, accredited journalists, and attacking media buildings, that I think there's just too much truth out there, and more people have shifted. I mean, I can't say what the percentage is, but I think more and more people, especially younger, are online and they're not watching TV. So they're coming across multiple accounts, including accounts of people maybe that have gained a trusted reputation for reporting honestly. And then people following them will see, oh my gosh, this is happening again. And this is just, it can't go on any longer. Israel is flat out murdering people with no pretext. And their pretext is self-defense, but we all know that's bullshit. It's just flat out murdering people. And I think that because of these factors, these combination of factors, the Israelis can't hide their crimes well anymore. And that's probably one of the main reasons.
Yeah, would you say that Israel is losing the narrative right now?
Absolutely. I mean, they can cry about resistance rockets, and I fully stand by resistance in their right under international law to resist by any means possible. But nonetheless, although they are resisting in a much stronger manner than we've seen in previous Israeli massacres of Gaza, you still cannot compare in any sense the ammunition, the weaponry, the full-on Air Force, Army, Navy, tanks, Apaches, and then precision, high-tech missiles and weapons we can't even conceive of that Israel has to what the Palestinian resistance have. There's no comparison.
Yeah, the immediate reaction to the genocide of Palestinians has been Hamas, Hamas, Hamas. Like everybody in the Western media, especially in the United States, hears Hamas. And what the vast majority of people do, even people who are sympathetic to Palestinians, they'll say, well, we have to condemn Hamas. Can you give me your take on Hamas? I am kind of sick and tired of hearing about the manufacturing of consent via Hamas.
My take is I support all Palestinian resistance factions. They have, again, must be stressed and underlined, the right to resist their occupier, which has for 7 decades been genociding Palestinians. And even when there's no war, life in Gaza is a slow genocide. And we can speak about that in more detail if you like. But the bottom line is, whether it's Hamas or Islamic Jihad or Palestinian Liberation Front or whomever, they all have the legitimate right to resist. Whether you like them and what they stand for, I personally don't like Hamas's Muslim Brotherhood affiliation, not affiliations, they are Muslim Brotherhood. Personally, I don't like that. I don't like that Hamas betrayed Syria. But in terms of their right to be resisting, they do have that right. So I think the people that feel this need to give a caveat, I support Palestinians, but it's the same people that would say, I support Syrians, but, and then go on to say something stupid and cartoonish about their elected and beloved, frankly, president. It's a moral cowardice. And they're in no position to make these judgments because they're not the ones living under the bombs. And if it's not bombs, they're being starved, they're being shot at while they try to fish or farm. They're not the ones living that. So they have no place in making judgments.
Yeah, you talk about the slow genocide of Palestinians. It's not always bombs dropped on hospitals or on roadways to hospitals. It is also the just impeding them from getting their basic human needs. Can you speak on that when you were there and you lived with these people, how that actually happens?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to point out is that nobody really wants to live on handouts. And Palestinians are very dignified. They don't want to be receiving UN paltry food aid. And it is paltry, the UN and the other aid. It's enough to live, to subside, to exist. And it's worth pointing out that now I'm not positive about the year. I want to say in 2008, Israel actually concocted a scheme in which it calculated the number of calories Palestinians in Gaza needed in order to simply exist, and they translated that into the number of aid trucks that were allowed into Gaza, and then I believe they cut that number in half. So I think it was Dove, I can't remember his last name, said to put the Palestinians on a diet. I mean, that's not a diet, that's a starvation ration. So there's that. And then they've taken away essentially Palestinians' ability to work in any sense. As I mentioned, I lived in Gaza for 3 years. And in that time, when it wasn't being warred upon by Israel, a lot of my work comprised accompanying farmers and fishers. And there should be no need to accompany them. They're completely capable of doing their own work. And we weren't accompanying them to do the work for them. We were accompanying them to be a visible presence to these genocidal Israeli soldiers who come up to the border and fire on what are clearly unarmed Palestinian farmers, whether they are young men working as laborers, whether they are entire families from children to elderly. They fire on them. And it also must be stressed that that border region, aside from being the most fertile region for agricultural farming, is also a region that has been devastated by Israeli bulldozing and razing. So there's not many trees there. There used to be. So with the naked eye, this is back to what Israel would claim, the reason that they're gunning down these farmers and laborers in the borders. Israel would say it's self-defense, and that's utter nonsense. Israel says that Palestinians can't be, it was 300 meters from the fence imprisoning Gaza. But in my experience with farmers, they would shoot at us when we were 500, 600 meters away or more. And this is with live ammunition, not rubber bullets, not tear gas, live ammunition. And they shot around us. They clearly wanted to intimidate. They clearly knew from precedents of Rachel Corrie and Tom Herndale, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing his last name, that murdering internationals in Gaza is problematic, but murdering Palestinians in Gaza is, for me, very problematic, but for international media, it's not. So they would shoot around us, but they would still shoot the Palestinian farmers or unarmed protesters or whomever. So back to your question, they've made it impossible for farmers to work on their land, whether it's for their own family's consumption or to sell or to work as laborers. They've made it impossible for fishers to do the same, who should be able to fish 20 miles off the coast, but the Israeli massive gunboats will attack the fishers when they're only like a mile or two off the coast. And they will even attack fishers that are on what looks like a surfboard. It's called a hasaka. And they paddle out and they drop their nets and later pull their nets in. The Israeli gunboats will even fire on these pretty well naked fishers, clearly no threat to their existence, clearly no threat to this massive Israeli gunboat. They fire on the Palestinian trawlers with heavy machine gun fire, with missiles, with high-powered water cannons that are doused with this skunk chemical that leaves them smelling like excrement for days. They abduct fishers, they take their boats and don't return them, they destroy their boats. So there's two industries they've destroyed. They prevent Palestinians from exporting. They dramatically limit the imports. And then whenever they're waging these wars on Gaza, they destroy the infrastructure. They destroy work warehouses. They destroy everything that Palestinians would need and able to work. So their poverty is entirely manufactured. And it is hell on earth. And I don't think people really realize it when they hear siege or blockade. They don't realize the extreme depravity of the Israelis and the Egyptians in complicity with them in doing this to Palestinians.
And as we know, the United States is complicit. The United States just approved $736 million to fund Israel. With all of this going on, the Biden administration still approved that. In the years that you've been in the Middle East, have you seen a significant difference between who has been the president of the United States and the actions in both Syria and Palestine?
No, generally my view is it doesn't matter who is the president. The same military regimes are going to march forward and occupy or further try to destroy countries. I will say this, not being a supporter of either party, I will say that Biden has far more blood on his hands than Trump does. Trump, yes, bombed Syria with 103, I think, cruise missiles or whatever type of missile it was, after the fake allegations of a chemical attack in Douma in 2018. And he did bomb, or his administration did bomb inside Damascus, which could have posed a significant risk because it was in an inhabited area of Damascus. It could have posed a significant risk of death to civilians. But my understanding, and I think it's kind of generally well known, is that there was some forewarning that these missiles were going to be fired. There wasn't a lot of damage done, not many lives, although any life lost is one too many. But compare that to, and I'm not defending Trump because his administration did continue to bomb Syria and other areas, and they did thieve Syrian oil and other resources, and they did continue supporting terrorists. But there's no comparison to the previous administration or to Biden, in my opinion. But the bottom line is these policies will continue no matter who is in charge.
Right. I want to ask you something about the, resolutions and the others, like the geopolitical aspect of it too, because right now I think some of the progressive members of the Democratic Party have put out a resolution. It is likely not going to pass. It's pretty much dead on arrival. Nancy Pelosi is a warmonger. She always approves money for war. She approved every single one of Trump's military budget. She's going to approve every single one of Biden's. We give almost $4 billion a year to Israel to do what they do, to commit genocide. Do you think that any sort of electoral resolution is going to stop this, or do you think the American public and the legislators, frankly, need to demand a complete defunding of Israel? What is the solution here to stop this from happening?
I agree with the latter, the defunding of Israel. And it's never going to happen, but in an ideal world, defunding of Israel, cutting ties to Israel, but that's not going to happen because Israel is their project in the Middle East, right? Or West Asia. And if you really want to support Palestinians, you have to be loud and clear about supporting Palestinians' right to resist, supporting Palestinian resistance. We have to stop normalizing them as quote unquote terrorists. They're not terrorists. The only terrorist in the region, aside from the ones that we've supported in Syria, is Israel. So we have to stop saying, well, I support Palestine, but, that's not supporting Palestine. That's you being a moral coward, not you.
No. But what, you've seen the protests. There were tons of people out in support of Palestine out in the streets, which, by the way, never happens for anti-war issues, for foreign policy issues here. It just doesn't. I covered the Black Lives Matter protests last year, and a lot of these protests, they get co-opted for political capital, for political narratives. So seeing 25,000 people in Los Angeles when people don't come out usually for for issues regarding imperialism is significant. Do you think this is a potential chance to get, some sort of push for an anti-war movement? Because Americans are largely ignorant or completely just wrong when it comes to foreign policy and the anti-war movement. Most can't even point Palestine on a map. Like this is like an area where the vast majority of people who consider themselves leftists in the United States or anti-war type of people, they need like a push to really understand the geopolitical side of this.
Well, I think the problem is you mentioned being co-opted, and I think that's a huge problem because people might have good intentions and want to support Palestine, but then, they might follow some particular person or group, anti-war group, so-called, that has been co-opted, and that will bleat out the rhetoric about Syria. So how are you going to have an anti-war movement when they still believe, that there was a revolution in Syria and the big bad regime? I think it's extremely difficult. That said, some years ago in 2016, there was a Hands Off Syria coalition. I think it was handsoffsyria.net that formed in the US, and it did have a number of really strong anti-war groups. I can't remember which at this point. That gave me some hope, but I'm not hopeful because then you have back to Trump and Biden or whatever parties you want to talking heads you want to talk about. I've seen people who understand that's what's happened in Syria wasn't a revolution. It was a war on the people of Syria, and they support Palestine, but they were cheering on Biden when the elections were happening. And I just said, like, you're intelligent, you have a legal background, you've seen the propaganda for decades, and now you're cheering him on because he's talking about healing. So I think that I'm American, so I can say this. I think Americans are too far gone. Like, I don't know what it will take for them to really stand back and realize, I was talking with Marwa Osman, a Middle East a geopolitical analyst, journalist, and she's from Beirut.
Yeah.
And she made some really interesting points about unity, this new unity that's they're seeing, because she's really, zoomed in, and she's, of course, got a ton of resources and sources. She's talking about the unity among Palestinian resistance factions, but also then the unity amongst nations. And she was saying that this is a precedent, like because that the nations and the movements have been so divided, similar to movements in America getting co-opted. It's been difficult, but she said now they're all rallying around Palestine and putting aside their differences. I wish that would happen in America or in Canada or elsewhere, but realistically, I don't see it happening.
And as far as other countries, right, as far as Iran and Syria, geopolitically, what do you think their next moves are going to be regarding the Palestinian genocide?
I don't do predictions, so I can't really say. What I could say, I could list a number of people aside from Marwa to follow, Mohammed Morandi, for example, from Iran. I will say that they continue to support Palestinian resistance and the Palestinian people. And as I recall, one of the missiles that struck an Israeli jeep, I believe it was, along the Gaza fence, was a Cornet missile sent from Syria. And I know I've seen other things, on Twitter. I don't follow militarily so much. It's hard just to keep abreast of everything. But I know I've seen other things on Twitter from sources I trust talking about Syria's continued support to Palestinian resistance, including training them in, missile technology. But anyway, there is this continued support for the resistance. I know I've asked other people the same question you've asked me. And I think the feeling is the resistance in, Hezbollah, in Syria, in Iran are there when the time is necessary. But I think the feeling, if I remember, I don't want to paraphrase wrongly, the feeling is that to this point, Palestinian resistance can handle themselves with some degree of support. So I don't know, what it will take for Syria, Hezbollah, Iran, and other allies to become really strongly and visibly involved. You're
an independent journalist. You know what that means. It means that you are constantly critiqued, you're constantly undermined, you're constantly they try to paint you as a conspiracy theorist, especially in regard to the Syrian chemical attacks, right? What have you seen any improvement on that in terms of gaining ground for independent journalists, and in terms of that versus the mainstream media? Do you feel like the mainstream media has at all just begun losing the veil that it's been wearing for so long?
I do, and again, I can't like give any sort of statistics or cite any studies or polls to that effect. The mainstream media is failing, but I think the fact that they do need to smear little old conspiracy theorist me so often, or Vanessa, who you've had on your show, or any of us who are speaking, if we're so non-credible, why are you wasting your time on us? So clearly that indicates that there is some threat from independent media to the mainstream narrative, the mainstream media. And those narratives are so easy to poke holes in. I mean, all we had to do was actually go to Syria and talk to people, including medical staff and civilians. Most of the time when they fabricate these stories, it's the Guardian's Karim Shaheen in Istanbul, or the Independent's so-and-so in Beirut. Most of the time they're reporting from outside of Syria and then relying on like the one-man dude in the UK, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, or these various unnamed sources that they always rely on, or media activists that always, it turns out, have allegiances to terrorist groups in Syria. So I think conversely, when they smear independent journalists, it does have an opposite effect. Okay, there are some that'll be like, oh, look at Eva Bartlett's Wikipedia entry. Oh, she's such a conspiracy theorist. And look, North Korea paid for her trip to North Korea. They didn't. Or look at Snopes' entry. But yeah, there are some that will believe that. But I don't care. There are others that come to me and they say, I used to think this, but now I think this. Or others who got it all along. So I've just seen for myself an increase of support. And as far as the smears, I don't care. Okay, at first it used to be like, hey, that hurts, don't say mean things. But now I really don't care. And that's the thing. They think by smearing us that we're going to cower and say, well, gosh, I don't want my reputation smeared. I don't give a shit. Go ahead and smear me. No matter how many times they smear us, I think I can speak on Vanessa's half as well as her friend. And just knowing she's gone through actually probably a lot more smears than I have due to her excellent work on the white helmets. We don't do this as a career. So when you do something, and this actually, I could draw a kind of parallel to resistance. When you do something because you believe in it, then nothing's going to stop you. And likewise with resistance, they are the righteous ones. As Laith Marouf, who I spoke to, pointed out, they have the righteous cause on their side. And I don't mean anything to do with religion. I mean, they're the ones occupied and they have the righteous cause of fighting for their freedom. And their occupiers, they don't have the righteous cause, and the lying media don't either.
And just the last question, in order to help, right? People who want to help, people who want to continue pushing aid to Palestinians, continue pushing the defunding of Israel, what should people in America and in the West do? What should they be doing right now?
It is extremely difficult to get aid to Palestine or to Syria, because I've had people ask me many times, precisely because of the siege or blockade on Gaza and the sanctions on Syria. So unless you know somebody trusted that is able to go to either of those places, it's almost impossible to get aid to those, or money, I should say, to those places. I really, again, referring to when I was speaking with Laith, he was making some points. He was saying like, okay, well, I'm paraphrasing, you can go out and protest, and I've done that many times myself, and I still would if I were there. But you can also take concrete action and really show the Israeli occupiers that their continued violence doesn't even suffice, is seen, and you're going to hit them economically. So not just BDS, but actually, I love the suggestion. In Canada, we have LCBOs, it's the liquor store that sells liquor and so on, alcohol. Go in there and bash Israeli wine bottles. I thought that was actually pretty funny. Or, doing direct action against weapon manufacturers, things like that, like hardcore action. I think now is the time for more hardcore action that will land people in prison for a certain period, but it's not going to be, comparable to being imprisoned by Israel or another entity. So I think people need to be thinking more, again, of direct actions, but also I really, really feel supporting resistance and making that vocal and normalizing the fact that they are resistance and not terrorists is extremely important.
Well, thank you, Eva. I really appreciate you coming on here. I admire your work. I admire the tenacity of going into places where most journalists wouldn't go, and where the real journalist would definitely not dare go. So thank you very much for taking the time, and I wish you luck on everything else. Where can people find you, by the way, to get a hold of you, your work?
My blog is ingaza.wordpress.com. I'm on Twitter. Again, I went off, but I'm back on at Eva K. Bartlett. I'm also on Facebook under my name, Eva Crean Bartlett. And I do have a link tree, which I can send to you if you want to post that. And that has links to my Subscribe Star and other platforms.
Thank you so much, though.
Awesome. All right. Thanks for having me on.